My name is Robin Martin. I've recently joined the Manning Centre Board of Directors, and I'll be chairing the next session on strengthening taxpayer and investor confidence. I hope you all had a chance to visit our exhibitors, but if you didn't during this short break, please do so during the other breaks. There's some great exhibitors out there. And I'd also like to thank the Canadian Health Food Association for sponsoring the coffee break. Our first guest for this session is the president and founding shareholder of Questerre Energy, a public oil and gas production company operating in Quebec. Questerre and its predecessor, Ternex, have been pioneers in the natural gas exploration industry in Quebec for the last 20 years. They are currently working on their social license to commercialize the Utica shale gas discovery in the lowlands. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Michael Binion.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Bonjour à tous. I want to thank you, Robin, for that kind introduction. I especially appreciate it as the person on the stage who actually needs an introduction. I also want to thank the Manning Foundation and Manning Centre for the invitation to share this stage with the person who doesn't need an introduction, Minister Oliver. J'ai rencontré le ministre la première fois à Montréal quand j'étais le président de l'Association pétrolière et gazière du Québec. Minister Oliver is as plain speaking in private as he is in public. And Canada needs leaders to point out the positive impacts of our resource industries, and Minister Oliver was never afraid to do just that as Minister of Natural Resources. It's my privilege today to be asked to share with Finance Minister Oliver my views on what is needed to strengthen investor and taxpayer confidence in our national economy. I'm actually here wearing a few different hats. I am indeed here primarily as chairman of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. I also bring the perspective of our country's oil and gas associations, the perspective of a former tax accountant, and of an entrepreneur who's immersed in startups and who's directly impacted by the level of confidence of investors and taxpayers in our economy. What I'm not here as is a CTF communications director whose job it is to be more polemic. These incredible men and women represent the ideals that our federation stands for, ideals that I believe will always need to be fought for, because the real world is complicated and ultimately a compromise among competing ideals and interests. We understand well that Minister Oliver, no matter how plainly spoken, lives in this real world of the art of the possible. Albert Einstein is widely quoted as having said the most powerful force in the universe is compound interest. In politics, we might be able to say the same about incremental reforms, that when relentlessly applied every year, compound into larger and more enduring change than one-shot radical reform that may not survive the next government. For example, with no single dramatic tax reform, but rather a series of annual changes since this government took office in 2006, our tax burden slowly became competitive. The GST has been cut by 2 points, and impressively, the general business tax has been cut from 21% to 15%. In 2000, Canada had the second highest business taxes of the 34 OECD nations. Today, Canada has leapt over 12 other countries and is now in the middle of the pack. Meanwhile, our neighbors to the south have tumbled 5 spots to the highest business taxes in the OECD. And we need to remember it's not just taxes, but debt and deficits that make up the fiscal burden. For eliminating the deficit in some of the best budgets in the past decades, we offered former finance and Prime Minister Paul Martin our highest award, the Tax Fighter, at the World Taxpayer Conference we hosted last June. However, it became a little awkward when he told us he wasn't actually against higher taxes. What he was against was transferring taxes to future generations, because he well understood that a deficit is just a future tax. So he ended up giving the former Prime Minister a newly minted Stop the Clock Award, which he accepted with grace, and the words he was just glad not to have to see that damn clock anymore. During the 2008 financial crisis, the CTF was the first to call publicly on the government not to resort to fiscal stimulus. At first, the Harper government heeded this call, which led to opposition party threats to bring down the government, and also the Economist headline asking Mr. Harper to please have the decency to panic. My father says, "I told you so" is cold comfort, and it is cold comfort. For us to say, "We told you the stimulus binge was ill-advised," we are still feeling the effects in the form of an additional $150 billion of additional debt, as well as deficits every year since. It took a while, but we finally found the debt clock that had been parked in a farmer's field since 1997, and after some badly needed repair, was put back on the road in 2011. But to give credit where due, unlike some other governments, province of Ontario leaps to mind, this government has clawed its way back by increments towards what we hope, and I am sure Minister Elver will have something to say about this, is a balanced budget. I can assure you the CTF looks forward to taking its well-traveled debt clock back off the road again, hopefully long enough that we'll forget where we put it again. I think the most important thing for your government to do, Minister Elver, for taxpayer investor confidence, is stick with your strength. Continue to be relentless on making incremental change every year to lighten the burden of taxes and debt on taxpayers and investors. Your proposals for further targeted tax cuts are far from ideal in our opinion, but they do at least put money back in taxpayers' pockets, and so are not a step in the wrong direction. If your government has been successful at making Canada fiscally competitive, then why is the United States once again the stronger economy? Why, for example, starting later, will Americans finish earlier on delivering liquid natural gas to critical Asian markets? Why are investors and taxpayers more confident in America? As global specialists and leaders in a safe and reliable supply of resources to the world's largest economies, there's no doubt that commodity prices and Asian demand are part of the answer and not within your government's control. Even so, we need to realize that when commodity prices are low, whether it be the price of wheat, fish, iron ore, oil, or softwood lumber, that competitiveness and confidence are more, not less important. But we think the other part of the answer can be found in Ronald Reagan's famous quote about the attitude of government: if it moves, tax it; if it keeps moving, regulate it; and if it stops moving, subsidize it. We've seen a proliferation in uncertain regulation and societal complexity that is blocking projects and investment. Distorting transfers compound the problem. The United States is not beating us to Asian markets because they have a lower tax burden. It's not because they don't have protesters. It's because when it involves America's strategic interests, their regulatory system works. I want to say that again. The most complicated and most litigious society in the world, with the OECD's highest business taxes, is able to move projects through the regulatory system faster than Canada. Canada will not remain a global leader in resources for long if we don't diversify our markets and just go on selling our country's biggest export to refineries in blue states at deep discounts to the world price. In very simplistic terms, we're just giving away plus or minus $20 billion a year to stimulate the American economy, and worse, transferring around $8 billion a year in associated taxes and royalties to pay for American social programs instead of Canadian ones. All because our regulatory system is not serving Canada's strategic interests well, and Mr. Minister, I know you've spoken passionately about this very issue. Stability, simplicity, and previsibility are the most critical factors in taxpayer and investor confidence. To reap the advantages of making our fiscal burdens, middle of the pack, competitive, you must also turn your policy of incrementalism towards predictability of regulation and eliminating the negative incentives, for just one example, workforce mobility, of transfer programs. While the financial burden of our taxes is coming down, sadly, the red tape burden is increasing. Our CTF supporters continuously tell us they prefer simpler and flatter taxes. Many would take simplicity over lower rates. I was a tax accountant with Ernst & Young in Toronto during the ministries of Michael Wilson and Perrin Beatty. It was a brief era of tax reform that mirrored to some extent the Reagan tax reforms. Mr. Wilson repurposed the Tax Act as an instrument of taxation and not of social policy. Mr. Beatty introduced basic fairness into Revenue Canada's administration. They introduced a general anti-avoidance rule and advanced rulings that were binding. The goal was to stop the exponential growth in the Tax Act, create more predictability, and improve fairness. Somehow we lost the thread. The Tax Act is now over 1 million words, and it's grown 200,000 words just under this government. We realized it would be unrealistic to return to the original 11 pages of the Tax Act in 1917. After that, all that was for a temporary tax. But perhaps, Minister Elver, you could direct your bureaucrats to reduce, rather than add, 25,000 words per year with the long-range goal of returning to the length and objectives of the Michael Wilson Tax Act. One area your government has created predictability and incentives for provinces to improve is with federal health care transfers. Why did your government not do the same with equalization when you had the chance 1 year ago? The equalization transfer formulas are too complex, with pernicious unintended consequences. In my opinion, it is no coincidence that the only places in the country with bans on natural gas development and hydraulic fracking are those who need economic development the most, but that are financially discouraged from doing so. We need to realize that equalization in its present form is less something we do for so-called have-not provinces as something we do to them. On the other hand, we're pleased this government has reduced another form of transfers. Corporate welfare is down to around $1 billion a year from over $2 billion a year at the height of the 2009 stimulus. But it's still a tremendous waste of public dollars. As Mr. Manning said when he accepted our Tax Fighter Award around 2 years ago, government is not good at picking winners, but losers are very good at picking government. Let me be clear, I'm a businessman, and I don't want subsidies. They're complicated, time-consuming, and frankly, just a distraction. But when government hands them out, it puts those who don't accept them at a perceived disadvantage. Worse, companies that do accept them and then waste taxpayer dollars make us all look bad. Government subsidies are constantly used by development opponents and protesters as proof government is in the back pocket of industry, as the reason the regulatory systems can't be trusted, and for why we don't deserve social license. Please, Mr. Minister, if you worry about reducing fiscal and regulatory burdens, you won't need to worry about subsidizing companies who stop moving. As I mentioned, subsidies don't help industry with social license either. This is the fastest growing area of complexity in our society. It's a well-intentioned but undefined regulatory burden that isn't written down, without rules, and generally as unpredictable as the politicians who succumb to it. We applaud some of the incremental changes that you've made, for example, to create defined beginning and end dates for public consultation processes. But you, like industry, are losing the public relations battle. It's a battle for Canada's strategic interests, and we can't afford to lose it. We understand electoral math is important, but you can't be seen just to be mathematicians and political strategists. Your government's incremental reforms have been aimed at making our Canadian society stronger and healthier for the people who live in it. To win the PR battle, you need to show your human side, because people don't care how much you know or how smart you are until they know how much you care. One of the most complicated areas for social license is with our Aboriginal peoples. The general state of our Aboriginal peoples is a national disgrace and proof that money alone cannot solve the problem. I find it incredible that the #1 source of brown envelopes exposing waste of taxpayer dollars coming to the CTF comes from women living on reserves. It was a proud moment for our CTF when our own, actually now the Manning Center's own, Colin Craig, was there to see the Transparency Act that we fought so long and so hard for sign into law. This bill is aimed squarely at the problems Aboriginal women have been complaining about. But we need to be better at showing our Aboriginal peoples that we do care about solving these problems. And on the topic of accountability and transparency, I'm the president of a public company, and I'm threatened with criminal penalties if I don't account transparently, thoroughly, consistently, with detailed and comprehensive standards, subject to external audits and regulatory oversight. The CTF turned itself around in the late 2000s by learning to walk our own talk on focus and accountability for our goals and resources. So our last recommendation today is that this government hold itself to the same standards it so over-regulates for others. Mr. Minister, you could make this reform and require your ministry to give unfettered access to the government's books, to the Parliamentary Budget Office and the Auditor General, Moreover, you could require that the government budgets and accounts be presented in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles consistently applied. A seemingly innocuous change in transparency makes a meaningful difference in accountability. It's likely why governments like it for everyone else and so dislike it for themselves. So in conclusion, Mr. Minister, I say keep up the good work. But high taxes are not the only obstacle to growth. By applying incrementalism to regulatory complexity and distorting transfers next, the government can send the right signal to taxpayers and investors and create a predictable environment that advances our nation's strategic interests to ensure Canadian society remains strong and free. Thank you all, et à vous, Monsieur le Ministre, for votre attention.
Earlier, someone said he needs no introduction. He certainly brings a wealth of experience in both the private and public sector to this critical role, starting with his time as an investment banker with Merrill Lynch, the regulator running the Ontario Securities Commission as president and CEO of the Investment Dealers Association of Canada, and of course as the Minister of Natural Resources. From the perspective of the banking sector, we appreciated his contribution and leadership last year on consumer issues as he guided banks and merchants towards a solution on credit card transaction fees, and also know him as a great champion of advancing financial literacy amongst Canadians. Being a G7 finance minister is never an easy job, and these days we all know that the domestic and international risks and threats we face call for the depth of experience that Mr. Oliver brings to his role as the Minister of Finance. As he prepares to deliver his first budget in the next few weeks, Mr. Oliver's topic this morning could not be more relevant in today's climate of change and uncertainty, strengthening the confidence of taxpayers and investors. This is an objective that we all share as employers and employees and Canadians in every financial and industrial sector of the country on Bay Street and Main Street. So it is my great pleasure to introduce the Honourable Joe Oliver, Canada's Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Preston Manning, Rex Murphy, if you're still here, I don't appreciate your having spoken before me. Can you imagine what it's like to speak after Rex Murphy? Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank everyone for being here and for being such loyal followers and militants for the Conservative movement and for the Centre. Every elected official knows that he or she is there only because of the devotion and the hard work of countless volunteers, people who raise money, people who go out and canvass, people who stuff envelopes. We're looking forward, of course, to your participation in the next election. Of course, it's not always easy to go out and knock on doors. Those of us who've done it, many, many times. I think I was up to about 38,000 visits to various residences in my riding over a 5-year period. We know that it can sometimes be daunting. And I recall a recent visit that I had with one of my volunteers. A lady emerged. One could see she was perhaps a bit of a hoarder, and because she liked to conserve things didn't mean automatically to me that she was a conservative. She announced immediately that her dog, who accompanied her, was incontinent, and the dog obliged by proving the point immediately within about 2 inches of my shoes. She went back and retrieved a little shovel, and while the dog's contribution was sort of, the aroma was wafting in the air, she proceeded to tell me that she'd written to the Governor General to have the Prime Minister removed from office. So I marked that down as probably not accessible and trundled on. But it is important, of course, to listen to your constituents. I recall the other day I was at a restaurant in the riding. A about to order, and a gentleman came up to me and he said, are you Joe Oliver? Yes. The Minister of Finance? Yes, I am. He said, well, Mr. Minister, I have some advice for you. It's very important, so I want you to listen very carefully. Make sure you order the cabbage rolls. They're delicious. We're counting on all of you to help in spite of the challenge. It's a great pleasure for me to be on the stage with Michael Binion and, of course, with Robin Martin. Robin ran my first nomination campaign in Eglinton Lawrence, and in many ways I wouldn't be standing here today if it were not for her. On the other hand, she didn't run my second nomination campaign. Mind you, it wasn't contested, so we forgive her for that. I respect Michael as a made-in-Canada business leader. I also respect him as a champion for taxpayers. Taxpayers need more advocates in their corner, and no one advocates with the ferocity of the CTF. I value their work, and I say this despite the fact that the CTF has criticized our government in the past. Politics demands pragmatism, but our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, has delivered the politics of principle and pragmatism. And the words of a former Prime Minister come to mind. Don't compare me to the Almighty, compare me to the alternative. Pierre Trudeau wasn't right about many things, but he was right about that. Whether he put himself in that category or not is yet another matter. The CTF's principles call for lower taxes, less waste, accountable government, and these are principles that I share. Friends, my values start with freedom. I believe in freer markets and freer Canadians. C'est pour soutenir la cause de la liberté que j'ai adhéré au Parti conservateur. C'est également la raison pour laquelle je fais confiance à ce gouvernement, la raison pour laquelle je me bats pour le Canada. The cause of freedom is why I joined the Conservative Party, and the cause of freedom is why I believe in this government. And the cause of freedom is why I fight for Canada. And we know that freedom works. Every year, the Fraser Institute publishes its Economic Freedom of the World Index. Using 42 variables, Fraser annually measures the cornerstones of freedom in 152 countries and territories. Nations in the top quartile of economic freedom have an average per capita income in excess of $36,000 compared to less than $5,000 for nations in the bottom quartile. In almost every measure, economically free nations outpace the development of their more socialist peers. And I'm proud that Canada once again ranked in the top 10 in 2013. Our Conservative government achieved that, and only Conservatives could have achieved it. Our party is firmly grounded in Conservative values, and our Conservative government grows stronger when the Conservative movement holds our feet to the fire. So in that spirit, I've come here to face the heat. We're talking about the way forward for the Canadian economy, how to strengthen the confidence of taxpayers and investors. And for me, there is only one way forward, the Conservative way. Michael's remarks addressed many issues, and I'll respond to a few of them as I can, and we'll have a little opportunity to discuss them further. Broadly, I want to touch on three things. Réduire les impôts et les taxes pour les Canadiens, faire du Canada le meilleur endroit au monde pour faire des affaires et donner plus de moyens d'action à notre secteur des ressources naturelles qui est de calibre mondial. Cutting taxes for Canadians, transforming Canada into the best place on earth to do business, and empowering our world-class natural resource sector. Let's start with taxes. I agree with Michael. There's more that we can do to reduce the tax burden, which, taking into account all levels of government, is at an alarming 42% rate on average for all Canadians. Keeping taxes low is good policy based on good principle and sound economics. Margaret Thatcher knew that with taxes too high, you eventually run out of other people's money. And I would amend that slightly. Eventually, you run out of money meant for coming generations. Taxing away prosperity robs our children and our grandchildren of their opportunity for a better life than we had. That is not leadership. That is irresponsibility and selfishness pursued by an overreaching government. Our way forward must be marked by keeping taxes low. You know the old saying, nothing is certain but death and taxes. Will Rogers once quipped that the only difference between death and taxes is that death doesn't get worse every time Congress meets. Well, there was a time you could say the same about Canada's Parliament. Not anymore. Stephen Harper has the best tax record of any Prime Minister in many decades. And the evidence is conclusive. The federal tax burden is now at its lowest level in more than 50 years. Not since Deef the Chief was Prime Minister have Canadians paid so little tax to Ottawa. And that took a lot of cutting. Sometimes we used a scalpel, other times we used a meat cleaver. And Tony Clement, I think, is here, and he wielded both, although with an emphasis perhaps on the latter. Altogether, we have provided tax relief over 180 times since taking office. We've lowered taxes of all kinds, like the GST, which we brought down to 5%, or our popular tax-free savings accounts. Last year, we announced the creation of the family tax cut. This non-deductible tax credit will provide up to $2,000 in tax relief for couples with children under 18. We also introduced our intention to increase and expand the universal child care benefit. Starting this year, parents will receive a check in the mail for $160 per child under the age of 6 and $60 per child age 6 to 17. And this is money we're putting back in the pockets of those who care most about their kids, mom and dad. We're also saving money for job-creating employers, which brings me to my next theme. Under our Conservative government, Canada today is one of the best places on earth to invest and do business. Michael and I agree. Job creators should spend more time growing their companies. They should not be choking on red tape and high taxes. So we cut red tape. We implemented the one-for-one rule. For every new regulation imposed by government, a regulation must be removed. And by the end of 2013, that rule had reduced the administrative burden by $20 million, and I thank my colleague Maxime Bernier for leadership on that issue. A study by PwC looked at 189 countries and found that preparing, filing, and preparing taxes each year takes a business in Canada 25% less time than a business in the United States. Canada is the only G7 country to rank among the top 10 based on the overall ease of paying taxes. We cut red tape, and we also cut corporate taxes. We cut them from 22% in 2007 to 15% today. Small businesses alone employ half of the working men and women in Canada's private sector. They account for a third of our country's GDP. So we cut the small business tax rate to 11% and increased the amount of income eligible for this lower rate. The result, more than $2 billion saved in 2014 alone. Then we introduced the Small Business Job Credit, saving entrepreneurs more than $500 million over the next 2 years. The results are crystal clear. They're clear when KPMG says Canada's total business tax costs are the lowest in the G7, 46% lower than in the United States. They are clear when Canada has the lowest overall tax rate on new business investment in the G7. They're clear when Bloomberg ranks us the second most attractive place in the world to do business. And they're clear when more Canadians are working today than at any other time in our history, with Canada enjoying its lowest unemployment rate in 6 years, with 1.2 million net new jobs created since the Great Recession. A generation ago, Conservatives stood on the shoulders of giants like Preston Manning and saw the opportunities to transform a country. So we did the work, and Canada is today transformed. Benjamin Disraeli, one of the great Tory statesmen of British history, believed that the greatest good you can do for another is not just to share your riches, but to reveal to him his own. I believe the Conservative movement and the Conservative Party have done just that. Brick by brick, we are building a Canada that is more confident, more prosperous, more sure of its place in the world. At the apex of our prosperity is the natural resource sector. And since Michael has brought up the challenges facing that particular industry, let me address it now. Before becoming finance minister, I spent almost 3 years as natural resource minister, and I gained a deep appreciation for the importance of natural resources to the Canadian advantage. It was resources that drove our earliest pioneers to push frontiers. Driving westward, they saw Canada as a rich cornucopia and worked to hew the rock. Today, Canada's natural resource sector, directly and indirectly, accounts for almost 1/5 of our economy and as many as 1.8 million jobs. In 2013 alone, Canada sold $128 billion in energy projects around the world. The oil and gas industry accounts for 7.5% of our GDP. And importantly, the resource sector provides an average of $30 billion every year in government revenue that goes towards hospitals and schools that Canadians rely on. In the coming decade, hundreds of major resource projects worth about $675 billion in new investment are underway or planned in Canada. And that is the action the private sector is taking. For government's part, we Conservatives are taking relentless action to ensure jobs and wealth-creating projects get off the ground. That includes modernizing the federal regulatory system for resource projects. We established clear timelines, reducing duplication and regulatory burdens, and focusing resources on large projects where the potential environmental impacts are the greatest. We're implementing system-wide improvements to achieve the goal, one project, one review, within clearly defined time limits. And we aim to create a more productive, predictable, and timely review process for the industry, one that provides greater certainty that investors can rely on. We're confronting critical strategic imperatives here. The imperative is to diversify our energy market. The fundamental fact is we have one customer for our oil and gas. However, the U.S. has found vast amounts of its own resources. Therefore, we need to move our energy resources to Tidewater to access the Asia-Pacific, among other markets. And to do that, we need to build pipelines. Now, that's another story which time doesn't permit me to discuss now, but my colleague Greg Rickford is consumed with that issue. We also aim to give all Canadian industries the benefits of fiscally responsible government that spends within its means. So I'd like to close by talking about the federal budget. And I'm proud to confirm that we will balance the budget this year. It was a commitment that we made in the worst days of the recession, and it's a commitment we will fulfill. Il importe de rétablir l'équilibre budgétaire. L'équilibre budgétaire renforce l'économie et nous protège contre les perturbations internationales comme la baisse des prix du pétrole. Il nous procure la marge de manœuvre financière dont nous avons besoin pour investir dans les programmes qui comptent pour les Canadiens et les Canadiennes. Il nous permet aussi de limiter notre dette, une dette que nos enfants et nos petits-enfants devront rembourser. Balanced budgets matter. Balanced budgets secure a stronger economy and protect us from international shocks like the dramatic decline in oil prices. They provide the fiscal flexibility we need to invest in programs that matter to Canadians, and they ensure we're not adding to our debt, a debt that must be paid by our children and our grandchildren. On the road to surplus, we have achieved great things for Canada. Federal spending as a share of GDP is at its lowest level since the 1960s, half that of the average of the G7. Transfers to people are growing while direct federal government spending has declined for the fourth year in a row, a rare achievement in Canadian history. And for that reason, and many others, I hope we will win and win a majority on October 19 so we can continue achieving for all Canadians. As the Proverbs say, where there is no vision, the people perish. Stephen Harper brings vision to government, conservative vision, and that is building a better future for Canada. Friends, the way forward for our economy, the way forward for Canada is a conservative way. Together, we can bring that vision to fruition and build for Canada the greatness that she deserves. Thank you all for listening. I look forward to a great discussion.
All right, well, I think we just have a few minutes for questions if we're going to keep on schedule. So if I understood your presentation, Michael, one of the main issues you think is the regulatory burden for businesses, such as yours and others. What are you looking for exactly from government?
Well, specifically, I think, and this is an issue that I think Minister Oliver recognized very well as Minister of Resources, and has said that our new Minister of Natural Resources is on these issues too. But specifically, it's the change in the regulatory field to not just be the written down burdens, but also this issue of having to now have social license, which I think is a societal expectation. But we're on the defensive end of that. I think industry did the worst job of losing our brand. I'm speaking specifically of mining and oil and gas, but resource industries generally have done a terrible job on our own brand. What worries me most now is the attacks on the brand of institutions like the National Energy Board and others in terms of their ability to regulate and to oversee the approval of projects. And as I said, there's other countries around the world all beating us to key markets as a result.
All right.
Well, I think you were talking about two issues, and really your focus wasn't on regulation, but rather, I think, on communication, as I understand it. And this is a big challenge, but one of the key elements in this, it seems to me, is a willingness not to be politically correct when it's not correct, and not to be defensive when we shouldn't be defensive, and to call a spade a spade. I think we have allowed a narrative to be created that doesn't match with reality. And that can cost this country a great deal. It took me about 2 years of repeating that the oil sands represent 1/1000th of global emissions before it started getting out into the press. And the only time they actually repeated it, or let me say it, was when there was a live TV broadcast. I mean, that's just one aspect of the facts that underlie the reality of resource development in this country. We have a record, an environmental record, we should actually be proud of and not defensive about. We won a very significant victory in Europe. It wasn't widely noticed. a fuel quality directive would have discriminated against Canada on a non-scientific basis. We presented the science, and Europe has finally backed off, not probably because the science was there, but because the rule that they were prepared to impose would have actually hurt their own refining industry. It also would have done absolutely nothing about greenhouse gas emissions. We have to get out there with the message which is based on facts and the reality, and we have to send out that message proudly and not defensively, because frankly, we've got the facts on our side. You know, there are those who want to oppose any form of resource development. That's not in Canada's interest. It achieves nothing actually for the environment, and I think we have to garner public support. Now, just one comment briefly about the issue of social license. You know, there's a word, there's a concept that has a certain appeal, because what it speaks to superficially is democracy. And of course, ours is a democratic country. But when you have a project that has been subject to an intensive, long, scientific, objective review, and the independent regulator has said that it's fine for the environment, there is no risk, and the elected government of Canada approves the project, an attempt to use the concept of social license is really to say that a small minority have a right to block a project which is in the national interest, which a lot of people actually support, and where the elected government has put its imprimatur on when after an independent regulatory review. We won't go ahead with any project which isn't safe for Canadians and safe for the environment, but when we come to the conclusion that it is, and the project is in the national interest, I think it's time to move ahead. So we have to be careful about these concepts and where they lead us.
I couldn't agree more. I think the issue is that this concept, social license, which I use just so that everybody knows what I'm talking about, because I agree with it, but it's becoming a de facto regulatory burden, just in the way you've described, and I think you're 100% right that we need to address it. And in Quebec, they've just started something called a Chantier de l'acceptabilité sociale to actually try to define what is social license, what is social acceptability, and does it mean that you have to have unanimity and minorities can affect the regulatory process in the way you say, or does it mean that a majority, and actually go out and define what does that actually mean in terms of community consultation?
Unanimity is not possible,
right?
And we have to acknowledge that. And if we insist on unanimity, our resources are going to be stranded, and an immense resource is going to be lost. And by the way, we're not just talking about a lost opportunity, we're actually talking about an economic decline, because the market that we've been relying on will not be there to the same extent that it is. So we not only have an opportunity to expand our market, we have to protect the market we already have by diversifying it.
So just switching gears, you said but balanced budgets.
This isn't my portfolio, so why don't we move to something
That's
that
right. You said balanced budgets matter.
Right.
And some people seem to think that budgets will balance themselves. I don't know if that
Well,
is...
if you have a trust fund, it's probably a little easier.
I don't know if that's still true within the context of the oil shock that we've just gone through. But why does balancing the budget matter so much? Some of the media has suggested maybe this government is too fixated on that.
Well, I think this is an important point. I mean, the first, obvious point is that if you balance a budget, you're not going to incur additional debt, and therefore you're not going to have to spend a larger portion of your revenue paying off interest. Rather, you can devote it to social programs, which Canadians want in the here and now. They also, a balanced budget creates confidence for investors, creates confidence for consumers who are likely to invest and consume. It protects our AAA credit rating with a stable outlook, which is the highest credit rating you can have, and therefore keeps our interest rates from going higher. A balanced budget also protects us from international shocks, like a decline in oil prices, which has an impact on our bottom line. If we were in difficult financial circumstances, that decline, that precipitous decline in oil prices would really have put us in a very difficult position. But because we're fiscally strong, we're able to deal with it. I mean, there's a hit, but it's a hit we can cope with. And the final point, of course, is the moral point. The more debt you incur now, the more debt that has to be discharged by our children and grandchildren. As families, we want the best for our children. The last thing we want is to spend money today that our children will have to pay off. So it does matter. And the issue of, there's an attempt to say, well, if you have a couple of billion in deficit, what does it matter in the context of an economy that's almost $2 trillion? Well, it matters not only for the reasons that I mentioned, but also because once you agree to a deficit, the difference between $2 billion and $4 billion doesn't really matter, and then you're down the path. I mean, if someone has a $10 billion deficit and you end up with $11 billion, well, the press is bad for half a day. If you say you're going to have a balanced budget, but instead you're showing a $1 billion deficit, that's a big deal. And so there's a discipline that's imposed by that commitment.
And Michael, I think you recognized the importance in your comments of a balanced budget. But you also said that some of your associates in business think that lower taxes, maybe up to a point, are a great idea, but they'd also like more simplicity in the tax structure. Can you just elaborate on what the desires of business are there?
Yeah, I think it was mentioned that the supporters at the CTF want simpler, flatter taxes that are easier to understand and some of them even more than a lower rate, which is to not say all of them.
Right.
Maybe not even a majority of them. I think the minister's absolutely right. I mean, we don't think you can separate out the issue of a deficit from tax. A deficit is just a future tax, and you will pay it, as the minister said, either in the form of interest or you'll have to pay it back in terms of principal, and it'll be something in the future who pays it back. So and as I said, Prime Minister Martin not in favor of lower taxes, but still was in favor of not transferring obligations to future generations because it is just another tax. And I think people like to talk about these deficits as if they're not going to ultimately be a tax. Not true. I do think that on the issue of the regulatory burden and transfers and so on and so forth, we do feel that simple and understandable is very important to people so they can understand if I make this much money, if I work that hour of overtime, what will my tax burden be? And that they can understand that quite simply is definitely important. And that the more we complexify things, the more we lose the benefit potentially of those lower rates.
And does the government have any plans with respect to simplifying things or in the tax structure?
Well, it's something we're looking at always, I can't indicate what's going to be in the budget.
Of course not. Of course not. Don't want to go there.
No.
A little too early for that.
Not even to this intimate group.
So I guess the thing that strikes me the most from a strengthening taxpayer and investor confidence is the factors that maybe aren't in control of the federal government. For example, provincial government policies, which may be heading in a different direction in certain areas, or the oil shock, or the headlines that I read every day in the newspaper about what's happening in the European Union, particularly in Greece. As a person consuming the news, there's a lot that sort of shakes your confidence. What can you say on behalf of the government that will make us feel a little bit better about the future of the Canadian economy, at least in this context?
Well, I think the point is that the Canadian economy is fiscally strong, and we're going to have a growth rate superior to that of most of the other G7 countries. People used to ask me, what keeps you up at night as Minister of Finance? After the oil price collapsed, they don't seem to ask me the question anymore. I guess they know. But the truth is, I've been to a lot of G7, G20 meetings, IMF, World Bank meetings, and there's an obsession about Europe and which is still at about $18 trillion, the world's largest economy. It's pretty well flat. There's a danger of deflation. We're not predicting it, but the inflation rate was negative, actually. So we're concerned about that. There are all sorts of geopolitical issues that are of concern. These are things over which we don't have control, and that's why it's so critically important that we remain strong in Canada. The other issue, of course, is the issue of national security. And just to make one brief comment about that, there is no obligation greater for a government than to protect its citizens and its sovereignty. It's something that Canadians don't think much about because ours is a peaceful kingdom, and we don't feel threatened and haven't until fairly recently. But the reality is there's a war being conducted by international terrorists, by jihadist terrorists, and we have to be strong. We have to recognize who they are, and we have to participate in an international effort to eradicate the threat that they represent. And we've got to do things in Canada, including amending our terror legislation to make sure that Canadians are protected. So that's an issue which you normally don't think about in the context of an election, but it's emerged as something that Canadians are concerned about. So while the economy is always front and center, it's the pocketbook issues that concern people the most, and I think it will be in this election. The issue of national security is also emerging as a concern for everybody.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank both of our speakers. That was really interesting, and I learned a lot. I hope the rest of you did as well. I also want to thank the sponsor of this session, CIBC, and Sharon Mathers, who introduced Joe. Thank you very much again for sponsoring the session. And I believe we have a brief break now before the next session starts at 11:15. So thank you very much for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.